Please remember to lower your hand again after you have spoken. Where forum members are required to vote on an item, we will conduct an electronic vote. If there are problems with the electronic vote, I will ask each member in turn to indicate verbally if they are for, against, or abstaining. If a forum member has not been present for the whole of the discussion on an item due to technical failure, they should not vote on that item. Are there any questions about the procedures before we continue? Okay, so moving on to item 1, which is election of chairperson. The custom for Herefordshire Schools Forum is for the chairperson to serve 2 consecutive academic years. The current chairperson, Cathy Weston, is unable to attend today, but has confirmed to the clerk that she is willing to serve as chairperson for her 2nd year. I therefore wish to nominate her as chairperson for 2022 to 23. Do we have a seconder for that proposal?
Yeah,
to second that.
Are there any other nominations?
I see none, Chair.
No, me neither, thank you. So the candidate has been added to the voting system, which will appear shortly on your screen. Please cast your vote and press the submit button. Would the clerk please bring up the voting screen?
That should be on screens now for everyone. There we go, and that has been unanimously carried, Chair. So Cathy Weston will be the chair for this academic year.
Thank you, everyone. We now move on to the next item, which is the election of a vice chairperson. Again, the custom is for the vice chairperson to serve for 2 years. I've confirmed my willingness to serve for a 2nd year. So as I am a candidate, I'll ask the clerk to conduct the vote.
Thank you, Alison. So I will, in lieu of the vice chair, just ask if anyone is willing to second Alison as vice chairperson for this year. Thank you, Paul. And are there any other nominations for vice chair? I see none. So again, the candidates have been added to the voting system, which I will launch. Should be on your screens momentarily. Thank you, and again that has been carried. So congratulations, Alison. And if you would like to resume you'll be taking the chair for the rest of the meeting as Cathy's not able to be here.
Okay, so on to item 3, which is apologies for absence. Are there any apologies today?
Yeah, Chris Lewandowski.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, and I've also got apologies from Andy Gosling, Tracy Neal, Steve Kendrick, Sean Lyons, Sheila Taylor, and Cathy Weston. I think that's everybody.
Okay, on to item 4 then, named substitutes. Are there any named substitutes for the meeting?
Yes, so we have Carol Rushton acting for Chris Lewandowski today. We have Lynn Johnson for Andy Gosling and Andrew Teal for Sean Lyons.
Okay, thank you. And on to item 5, declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest?
I think you're on mute, Paul.
Okay. I declare interest in anything to do with trade unions.
Thank you, that's been noted.
Okay, next item then is minutes. Are there any matters arising not dealt with elsewhere on the agenda?
There was one action on me, Chair, which was to write to F4, consult F40 about the results of a recent survey on energy costs from the DFE. I have been in contact with F40, but I think that has been largely overtaken by events from the government with their energy support scheme for members of the public and schools. I've also been in touch with West Mercia Energy, who supply energy to most of Herefordshire schools, and they tell me that they are fully hedged for this year and they are hedged for next year. So schools will not, Herefordshire schools will not receive the sorts of rises in energy costs that you've read about in the press. West Mercia Energy have also promised me a newsletter will be going out to schools. They said the end of September. But I've not seen anything yet. So I think Herefordshire schools are well protected as best we can. If there's any questions, I'll happy to answer them.
Could I ask, is that just for this year, Malcolm?
Well, West Mercia Energy are hedged until March 2023. They are then hedged again for the next following year, but there will be some price increases. And I think from memory, they said that gas prices were going to go up by 100% and electricity prices by 50% from 23-24. I'd expect them to confirm that in the newsletter to schools. And I'm not at all clear how West Mercia hedge prices relate back to the government support scheme. But certainly Herefordshire schools are in a better position than I've seen from some schools reporting in the press.
Only until next March.
To March 24.
Right.
Yeah, they hedged, the West Mercia are hedged for 2 years.
All right.
Ahead, yeah.
Thank you. It's helpful.
Okay, thank you, Malcolm. Are there any other matters arising? Okay, none that I can see. So please bring up the voting screen. If you are not present at the last meeting, you should select the abstention option at the vote.
Thank you. Those have been approved by those who were present, Chair.
Thank you. And next is item 7, local and national schools funding update. So I call on Malcolm Green to present the update, please.
Right, thank you, Chair. I have a PowerPoint presentation to share, which I'll endeavour to do that. Right, is that clear for everybody? Good, okay. Dedicated schools grant for 23-24. The first thing, just looking at the schools forum agenda, is to say that we have published in the Spotlight newsletter 2 new de-delegation proposals. The first one is the replacement of the government grant for school improvement. We had a grant that was worth £230,000 per year that was withdrawn by the DFE, and the DFE's solution is to say that local authorities can ask for de-delegation. The Spotlight consultation, which I think has a closing date on towards the end of October, is we will replace that with de-delegation of £12 a pupil. So I would sort of remind mainly local authority schools who de-delegation applies to respond to that consultation. The second new de-delegation proposal is to build up a contingency fund where we are asking for £3 a pupil for a period of 3 years to build up a fund for unexpected and significant costs. For example, employment tribunals, budget errors and various things like that. One school missed a number of pupils off their census, and at the moment we have no fund to do that. So we're asking for £3 a pupil to build up that fund. Again, that has a closing date of somewhere around the end of October on Spotlight. The other de-delegation proposal is that we have currently behaviour support services at £4 a primary pupil. That was agreed by Schools Forum last year for 1 year only, and we agreed that we would review the de-delegation of the behaviour support service with the budget working group in December. So we will be bringing forward some proposals to the budget working group in September, which will then come on to Schools Forum in January to look at the behaviour support service and whether the current de-delegation needs to continue or needs to be amended in some way. All the other de-delegations will have an inflationary increase of 1.9% added. The 1.9% comes from the increase in the DFE's per pupil allocation under the national funding formula. I'm happy to take any questions on de-delegation from members, although we will return to it in January, where Schools Forum has to approve the allocations. Nikki,
Yeah, hi. I was just asking, is this going to come as a separate amount, or is it to be sort of included in the formula for mainstreams? Because obviously there's no formula for specials. So will this be, how will specials be included in this?
The de-delegation is in effect top slice from mainstream school budgets, and we normally will send an invoice or a charge to special schools.
So the £12 per pupil of school improvement, we would just get £12 in times 72 or whatever in a separate payment or something that would come in the budget.
Yeah.
Okay.
Les?
Yeah, just that we would expect the behaviour support service to provide some information for schools to make an informed judgment about that element, I think, so that schools know what they're getting for their money.
Right, thank you. I'll move on then. The main item on the agenda is the usual budget consultation paper with schools, and the DFE have published the national funding formula, and our provisional dedicated schools grant gives us just over 122 million, and we can fully fund the national funding formula, and we can fund the minimum funding guarantee at 0.5% per pupil. Schools Forum now has very limited discretion to change the national funding formula. We are largely in the position where the DFE set out their proposals, and there are limited choices that we can make to change that. The minimum funding guarantee can be set between 0% and 0.5%, and those are statutory limits set by the DFE, and any change on that requires DFE approval. The reason the MFG is between 0 and 0.5% is that will bring schools nationally closer to the national funding formula. Something like 100 authorities out of 150 are on or very close to the national funding formula, and all the others are required to move towards it by 10% per year. The minimum funding guarantee sort of forces authorities to do that. The choice for Schools Forum and the discussions we had at the budget working group are the choice of the minimum funding guarantee, either at 0% or 0.5%. The minimum funding guarantee at 0.5% costs a little bit more than clearly 0%, and it supports mainly the larger urban primary schools in Herefordshire with higher deprivation. The maximum support for one school is 145,000 per year. That is because the previous Herefordshire formula was more generous and more targeted at deprivation than what the national funding formula is. The discussion we had at the budget working group last week was about how we continue to fund the SEN protection scheme, which, to remind members, is the scheme where we allocate additional funding for those schools with higher than average numbers of top-up funding for pupils. The base case that we looked at was the minimum funding guarantee at 0.5%, and that would give 375,000 available to transfer to the SEN protection scheme, and that assumes a 350k surplus from our growth fund. So you can see that the money, we have very little flexibility with the money. The national funding formula is fully funded from the DSG we get. The current spend of the SEN protection scheme is estimated at 619k for this financial year, and by coincidence that is virtually the maximum transfer that Schools Forum can agree at 0.5% from the schools block. Every consultation we've had with schools and every discussion with particularly primary schools and increasingly secondary schools, they have indicated that the SEN protection scheme is invaluable in providing the funding to help SEN pupils. We consulted the budget working group, and by scaling back the gains from those schools that are winning under the national funding formula, so we scale back their gains, that creates an additional surplus of just 274k, which when I add to the surplus that we expect in the growth fund will give us 615k for the SEN protection scheme. To give you an example of what those scaling back those gains mean, it means that a school that might gain 8% under the national funding formula would be scaled back to gain 6.5%, and a school that was gaining 3% would be scaled back to fund to actually receive a gain of 2.7%. So we are taking some of the gains of those schools fortunate to be winners and using it to essentially fund the SEN protection scheme. The difficulty we are going to have is that the SEN protection scheme, the costs are continuing to increase. The number of EHC plans, EHCP plans has, I think Les told me it has gone up by around 20% from last year.
Yeah, referrals were up 26% in the last financial year.
Yeah, so the costs of the SEN protection scheme are going to continue to rise. That will become a problem for the high needs budget because we are at the maximum transfer from the schools block. We have always taken the view we will fully fund the national funding formula and transfer what is left. So the proposal in the consultation paper is to fully fund the SEN protection scheme with the 0.5% of the schools block transfer and to scale back those schools fortunate to be winning under the national funding formula. We will discuss the outcome of the consultation, and I will be coming back to Schools Forum to ask for approval of the transfer of the 0.5% of schools block in January. In reality, that is the only decision we have to make regarding the national funding formula for 23-24. Again, it's probably sensible, Chair, to ask if anybody has questions now. Hopefully it's fairly straightforward, but I'm happy to answer questions on the detail.
Okay, does anyone have any questions? Paul, I can see your hands up.
Yeah, can I, I'm unmuted. Just to say, can I put on record huge thanks to Malcolm and the budget working group, because I think that the work that's done on this particularly complex area is incredibly important. And I know particularly for the children with special needs, etc. We're going into a very difficult time with regard to the cost of living and economy, etc. And it's very important that this is looked at very carefully, and I think it's always looked at thoroughly. And again, thanks to Paul and the people on Budget Working Group for looking at this in such a methodical and sensible and proportional way, because this is going to be, I think it's going to be a difficult time, and we need to make sure that we can sort of evidence thoroughness with regard to the money that's coming into the local authority. And so just an opportunity to say thank you, really.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned there about the budget working group. I know that Paul was unable to attend on the 30th of September. Are there any other members of the working group that want to feedback or comment on the recommendation that was made? I can't see any hands up. Am I right with that, Sarah?
Oh, I think was Dave.
I
think was trying to.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't find the emoticon. So yeah, that's a true reflection of our discussion with Malcolm.
Okay, thank you, David. So if there aren't any more questions, I will move the recommendation that the initial budget proposals for 2023 to 24 for schools and high needs, as outlined in the draft consultation paper, be approved for consultation with schools during the autumn term 2022. So please cast your vote and press the submit button. If you can't see the voting screen or are unable to vote, please raise your hand. Would the clerk please bring up the voting screen?
That should be on screen now. If we go through that, and then I think Malcolm then's just got a few other bits to pick up after that.
Do I vote on this or not from the TU point of view?
From this point of view, as we're just voting for the consultation, everyone is entitled to vote.
That's
Sue,
fine.
you've got your hand up. Are you having difficulty with the vote?
Yes, I can't see it now, so I'm saying yes.
Okay, thank you. That's fine. That's been carried unanimously. Thank you. Yeah. So that's fine. And yeah, I think Malcolm, you just had a few extra slides.
Yes, there are a couple of other things which I wish to share. So I'll go back to sharing the screen. Oh. So I'm going the wrong way. Right. Included in the consultation paper is a very provisional assessment of the high needs block. School forum members will know that we slipped into a very small deficit of 0.3 million at the end of March 22. DFE have given us a 1.57 million increase in our high needs allocation. That is down from previous years where we received a 2 million increase. I'm proposing that we allocate it as listed on the slide. The reason we slipped into deficit was we overspent by 750,000, and that 750,000 was largely spent on out of county independent schools. So a significant chunk of the extra money we've got will go on out of county independent schools. It's particularly important that we look to increase tariffs, and I'll be looking to increase tariffs in special schools, which is particularly D to F, by as much as we can get and twice what the mainstream tariffs are. We are looking to put some autism places in hand from September 23, so there's a bit of money for that. There's some more money. The PRU have asked for some more money for site leads, and there are some very small amounts to look at the behaviour-based tariffs at Brookfield, and to bring the early years high needs tariffs into parity with the schools tariff. So my initial view of this is the amount of extra money we've got does not look sufficient to set a balanced budget. So I expect that the high needs deficit will continue to grow. I'll just come on to that. Well, before I do, the next steps, we've got consultation with schools October to November. As I've said, the view is about funding the SEN protection scheme. We will review the consultation at the budget working group in December, including the dedelegation proposals. Our dedicated schools grant is confirmed in mid-December. I'll bring final budget proposals to the budget working group in early January, and then ask schools forum for agreement and decisions on the block transfer. And then we submit the national funding formula budget to the DFE on the 20th of January. The high needs block, we have more time to consider, and we will bring a final budget to schools forum on the 3rd of March. So it's all fairly straightforward. The budget working group asked me to look and see whether there was anything we could learn from the experience of other local authorities. And I looked at the top 5 local authorities with the biggest deficits and extrapolated how their deficits have grown. And I went back to 2016, where the deficits were really, really tiny. The average deficit in 2016 was 1.2 million for those 5 local authorities. And then their forecast for 24-25 was 117 million. So in a period of 8 years, those deficits of the top 5 sort of highest spending local authorities have gone from 1 million to over 100 million. If I apply those same percentage growth figures to Herefordshire, we start the end of 22 with a 0.3 million deficit, and we end up in 29-30 with a 30 million deficit. We are 5 years sort of behind the trend of the top 5 local authorities, but the same EHCP pressures apply to us. And I think when we went through this with the budget working group, we were all concerned at how quickly the deficit sort of rises. And we had quite a long discussion about actions we could take to try and reduce it. It largely depends on what we can do to minimise the cost of out-of-county placements. But if those trends apply to us in the same way that they apply to the other top 5 local authorities, then by the time we get to 29-30, we'll have a £30 million deficit, which is frightening. It is purely a statistical projection, and it is just an indication of where we might be heading. I'll open for questions, please, Alison, or discussions. Some people who were at the budget working group last week might want to comment as well, I think.
Okay, I can see Nikki's got a hand up.
I'm just going to say the same as I say every meeting, I'm afraid. The only reason, well, the main reason that the high needs budget is being overspent and is being used, you know, in a very, very creatively sensible way is that the high needs budget is having to address the fact that base funding for special schools has remained the same since 2014, whereas the costs of everybody's wages and everything else, which is meant to be covered by the base funding, has gone up significantly. So if, and we can only hope that they are going to do what they say, if they are going to increase the base funding for schools, it will reduce the need for the tariffs to be used to pay for things that the base funding can no longer cover. You know, the base funding is £10,000 per pupil, and that is meant to cover all of the costs of running a school, apart from the additional costs of running a school for young people with learning difficulties. It doesn't cover that anymore. And until they get that sorted, the high needs budget is going to come, and Malcolm is extremely clever at it. And, you know, my school budget is still not in deficit as a result of creative use of money. But yeah, that still goes without saying. The special school funding system is broken. It has not been increased for 8 years, and we all know how many of the costs have, including, you know, teacher salaries, national insurance, pensions, bills. So the high needs budget is the only way that special schools can address the increases in all of that, because the base funding hasn't gone up. I just want to explain that, because you know I say it every time, but if that was different, then the high needs budget is very unlikely to go into deficit, because we would be funded properly.
Okay, thank you, Nikki. Les.
Unmute. Just to come back to that point to start with, both the blocks of £10,000 and the tariffs are played from the high needs block, so essentially it's a trade-off between the two. So I don't think that would make a material difference to the high needs deficit, but the two biggest contributors to our overspend are the independent places that Malcolm has already mentioned, and the increased number of EHC plans that we write on the back of that increased referral rate, and each of those has a tariff attached to it. So just to give some idea of scale, from 2014 to now, we have doubled the number of EHC plans we have written, from something like 600 to 1247 at the last count. So, you know, you can see why the, you know, we're struggling. And I suppose, although those projections that Malcolm has rightly done to get ahead of the, you know, so we're warned, we are trying to put, you know, mitigation in terms of capital projects in, and the budget working group have asked for, you know, sort of an outline of what that looks like and what we might be able to mitigate in the medium term, you know, but for the foreseeable future, because those projects take 2 or 3 years to come to, at least to come to fruition, then we are going to have an increasing deficit, I'm afraid. So, but we're not ignoring it, I think.
Okay, sorry, I was still on mute, I thought. Okay, thank you. David Bennett, please.
Thank you, Alison. Just in response to Malcolm's request for a member of the budget working group, Paul wasn't there because he wasn't well. So just a reinforcement of what Les just said, to be honest, we reflected on the fact that we're spending almost 3 million this year, and it's something like 80,000 plus per place for independent placement out of county. And there needs to be a long-term strategy to increase capacity within the authority so that we don't have to do that.
Yeah, and I know that at Hash, the heads meeting next week, we've got a paper, haven't we, about alternative provision and looking for a review, because I know that amongst head teachers, certainly secondary head teachers, we're keen to find some solutions to those pressures around alternative provision. Okay, thank you. Any other questions? I can't see any others at the moment.
There's just one remaining item, Chair, if I may,
okay.
Which is just to inform Schools Forum that that I have applied to the DfE for approval to continue to fund East Nor Primary School's rent costs from the National Funding Formula. When East Nor became an academy 5 or 6 years ago, the DfE asked that we include the rent of the school in the National Funding Formula. They have now advised me I need to reapply for permission to continue to do that, and we have done that. East Nor is fairly unique, I guess, nationally as well as locally, in that they do not own their own school premises and they have to rent them from the East Newcastle estate. And if that money is not added to their school budget, then it's funding for the pupils that would have to pay for the rent of the school, which is, I think, particularly unfair. So I'll let Forum know how the application to the DfE progresses. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Paul Deneen.
Can I just ask about Nikki and with regard to why is it that the special schools, such as the one Nikki's involved with, isn't funded appropriately? Or what is the issue? Because it seems to me to be quite unfair for Nikki's situation to have, you know, the year on year sort of having to sort things out. Why aren't, what is the problem? Is it the pupil per pupil funding? You know, what is the issue? Because it just seems to be an outlier.
Liz would be able to know more than me from my perspective, Malcolm. You know, the government decided when they introduced the HCPs and the simplification of the funding, that every place was going to be funded at £10,000, and whereas the mainstream schools got a block, we don't get a block and then additional, it's just a per pupil funding, but it just hasn't increased. They've been talking about a special schools national funding formula for many years, and we have yet to hear anything about it more, but that's from my perspective as a practitioner.
Okay, Les.
All right, yeah, back off mute. Nikki, I think what Nikki's talking about are the blocks of £10,000, which make, as she said, makes up the base budget for the school. So, you you know, irrespective of the makeup of the pupils that she then takes. So, and that hasn't been increased by national government. We have to stick to that level. But what we are trying to do locally is to increase the tariff. So you will notice that when the tariffs go up, the ones that broadly cover the special schools go up by, I think, or double the amount that the others do. And that's our attempt to compensate for that lack of increase of the base funding. So in general, we're trying to apportion the funding across all activity, you know, all high needs activity that needs it. And, you know, we're trying to be as fair as we can, distributing that across the various things we need to cover. But fundamentally, there's not enough money to give a big hike in any one of those areas, you know. So yes, and you know, just to come back to Nikki has worked extremely hard to stay, you know, within her budget, within those constraints. So it's just difficult at the moment all round, you know. So it's a national issue, really, that particular thing.
Thank you, Les. Malcolm, your hand was up, but it's gone down again.
I think Les has answered mainly. The national funding formula for mainstream schools has a lump sum allocation to cover fixed costs, and that is increased by inflation each year. It started off at about 103,000 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, and it's now 128,000, just to give a measure of how much it's increased by. As Nikki says, the £10,000 is also meant to cover the lump sum, same lump sum in special schools for fixed costs, and it has remained fixed. So if it were to have risen in line with inflation, it would probably be 12,500. That £10,000 is used in the funding that the DFE give us for the high needs block, and therefore, in a sense, it constrains the funding we get and the funding we can give to special schools. So as Les says, it's a national issue, really.
Thank you. Back to you, Paul.
Well, the thing is, well, what are we doing about it? And what can we do to support the children who are in special needs schools? I mean, I noticed in the minutes that we were looking to involve the MPs, and it may well be they need a paper to explain to them that there are young people in our schools in Herefordshire, in special needs schools, some of the most vulnerable we've got, and yet the funding is not being fairly given to support those young people. So I think, you know, perhaps to ask the budget working group or a schools forum whether or not, you know, we do contact the MPs to say, look, you know, we in Herefordshire, this is our model of working. There's a tendency, I think, in Westminster to think of the Westminster model or the city model. You know, I think we need to do what we can to support the special schools, and particularly on the funding, you know, per pupil, to make sure it is fit for purpose, rather than every year, Nikki having to make a special case to you know, to Herefordshire Council for additional funding. That just seems to be additional pressure. I mean, she's going to have to do as it is, I would have thought. And I hasten to add, I've not spoken to Nikki, so this isn't as if we've had a conversation, but I do think it's something that needs to be given some sort of discussion, probably with our local members of parliament, who I would have thought would have been quite supportive about the issue. But I just think that it just seems unfair that Nikki has every year to put forward a special case to receive additional funding.
Okay, thank you, Paul. David, your hand's up.
Yeah, just a response to Paul there. It is actually a wider issue than that. Yes, I agree with everything you've said about Nikki, but there is a lot of demand outside the special schools, so that we don't have enough capacity within the authority. That's why there's been an attempt to get a free school for special school, and also there's a potential proposal for an AP free school as well. But it's an ongoing issue, and it's not going to get any better unless central government improve the rates at which they supply for special schools and education generally.
Thanks, David. Les?
Yeah, just for clarity, Nikki isn't making a special case for her special school. Sorry, it's the same for all of the special schools. I mean, Nikki happens to have a slightly smaller school than some of them, so that makes the budget tighter. But and even if we made the decision locally to pay, say, 12,500 instead of 10,000 to cover the base budget, unless we get an increase in the grant from central government, and that, you would have the same issue in many other local authorities. So unless that happens, then we're no better off. We can't give Nikki any more money. So we're trying to give her as big a share as we can of the pot that covers all of the high needs functions. So yeah, difficult.
Okay, thank you. Paul Jennings, your hand was up, but it's gone down.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I was just going to say that in the past, Budget Working Group have invited our MPs for discussions about schools funding and special schools funding. It may be something that's better coming from Schools Forum, because it's fair to say that about 50% of our local MPs actually showed any interest last time. So let's hope that we have a better uptake if we're going to take this.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, I have a question. Sorry if I should know the answer, but I don't. Is that something we're going to minute as an action point to contact MPs to invite them?
If Forum want to try and arrange something again for them to engage with us, we can certainly make that as an action and see what response we can get.
Okay, Malcolm, your hand's up.
Yes, thank you, Alison. The £10,000 fixed sort of place funding for special schools should be addressed in the government SEND review. They are well aware that it hasn't been uplifted, and as yet we haven't really seen any financial proposals following the publication of the SEND review. We know there's going to be the implementation of a national tariff scheme. Beyond that, I guess we are waiting further information and consultation from DFE. So I'm not sure writing to the MPs will achieve a great deal. And as Paul said, we get very little response from half of the MPs. So I think it's more a matter of waiting for progress from the DFE, to be honest.
Okay, thank you. Nikki.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I am here representing all of the special schools and special academies as well. So yeah, it's a countrywide issue, and I think if hypothetically, even if we didn't follow VAT and inflation, even if that had gone from 10 to 11,000, that would mean that a school of my size would have an additional £72,000 that then we didn't then have to use tariffs to pay what should be covered by the lump sum. So it's just mad economics. But until, if the government is able to then increase the grant, which we would hope, but they don't have a great deal of money. But if they did, then the pot that is the high needs would increase, and then the tariffs would then be able to be spent more fairly on actually supporting the young people in class, in all classes, in mainstream schools as well, rather than have to fund some of the basic bills that the special school buildings have to pay. And obviously some of them are pretty old now, so those bills are higher than they would be if they were brand new buildings.
Okay, thanks, Nikki. Back to Paul Deneen.
Yeah, finally, do you know what? There may be more interest from MPs if there's an election coming up. And I think we should really perhaps just give that a bit of thought, because there's all sorts of rumours circulating in the media of a potential election. And it's funny how when there's an election, there's a bit more interest in what's going on in local communities on particular issues. And I think this is a highly sensitive one. So I think I'm not going to make any recommendation or proposal, but I think it's something we should just be aware of. And it may be, Nikki, that you target the MPs on behalf of all the special schools, perhaps, and write to them and invite them into the schools and look at it from that point of view, and then perhaps report back. And if necessary, then perhaps a schools forum could invite them, as a sort of second bite to the cherry if necessary. So just some thoughts really. But when I heard earlier, I thought, no, it just didn't seem. The issue for me is about fairness, and I can't understand why your area hasn't been somewhat prioritised, and I think some work to be done really. Hope that's been helpful anyway.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. So I can't see any more hands, so that will bring a close to that particular discussion. Okay, I'll move on to item 8, which is the work programme for 2022-23. Forum members are asked to please note the dates of future meetings and proposed work programmes for 2022-23. Are there any additional items that forum members wish to propose for the work programme? No, so are we in general agreement for that programme? Okay, lots of nods, can't see anybody disagreeing. Okay, thank you. So the final thing to do is to close the meeting. Thank you all for attending. I'll call the meeting to a close. The next meeting is on Friday, the 13th of January. Please can I have confirmation that the live stream has stopped?